Americans for Safe Access is celebrating our 23rd anniversary. For over 2 decades, we've brought medical cannabis stakeholders together to meet the immediate needs of patients while addressing knowledge, policy, and regulatory gaps, clearing the way for a national medical cannabis framework that serves all patients. What you may not know is that ASA has been women-led ever since I founded the organization in 2002. So for our 23rd anniversary, I've created this series where I've interviewed women who have taught me everything I know about medical cannabis. My next guest, Dr. Julie Johnson, is really who you hope would be a cannabis regulator. She's a true ally to medical cannabis patients, and I think she really represents a new era of cannabis regulations. So we move away from sort of law enforcement to really trying to unlock the data between patients and the medicine they need. Hello, Julie. Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you finding the time.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to always talk about medicinal benefits of cannabis for patients and all of the important work that you've been doing. You are a pioneer in this space, so thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. I think what is so exciting about where we are in cannabis right now is that everyone is bringing their own experience to this space and contributing. When I first started Americans for Safe Access, I couldn't, first of all, there weren't that many people doing research except for the harms. I couldn't even find researchers or doctors to put their names on like educational materials, right? They weren't a part of it. So I'm so excited that we have you in this space, and excited for folks to meet you and learn more about what you're doing. So why don't we start with just telling me a little bit about how you found your way in this exciting cannabis world.
Yeah, absolutely. And interesting enough, you just mentioned finding researchers that would be able to put their names on things, especially risking for federal funding and stuff like that. When I was doing my PhD, I wanted to submit to the National Institute of Drug Abuse to discuss marijuana and cannabis laws and how they affect youth access. And my mentor at the time was like, "Don't you can't do alcohol. I mean, you can't do marijuana because you can't touch this with a 10-foot pole." And then I was like, I ended up getting funded for a pre-doc fellowship by NIDA to study cannabis laws and youth access and their use of cannabis, alcohol, and other drugs. So I got into the space as actually a teenager. I had lost, so my brother used to use cannabis and self-medicated for many years using cannabis. And then, I've spent basically my career trying to figure out, the youth, not only the youth access piece, but how is cannabis beneficial and medicinal and what are these properties? Because everybody's using it, but we don't necessarily have a causal mechanisms or clinical indicators and things like that. And we know being in the field, it's just got so much more messy and we necessarily don't even have the research that we need to support cannabis as a therapeutic agent. So I've been in the space for about 20 years now. So alongside you, but you've been doing so much greater work in getting patient access. And, I've just been behind the scenes trying to figure out how I can research this and use that information to advocate and to be to fill in those gaps. What are the research gaps? What are the policy gaps? What can policy learn from research? And so it's really been a huge priority for me, throughout the past 20 years.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, I think that what we're finding a lot of right now, I feel like as we're seeing cannabis be introduced into more professional spaces, right, is really a need to fill in the why, right? So we can there's a lot of data, that we've gotten from NIDA over the years, on the National Drug Survey, like how many people are using it. But what we don't have a lot of is the why.
Yeah.
And so I think, I personally quote your research, especially around the impact of adult use programs on medical programs. It's this experience that patients are having, and it feels like we're getting gaslit by everyone. Like we swear this is happening, right? We can't find the products we need. And so being able to point to a published study that is actually capturing what patients are experiencing is so important. So thank you so much for that work.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important. And I live in a state, just to preface too, like I am here in my own independent capacity. I'm not here as my position with Cannabis Control Commission to kind of discuss about my own passion with cannabis regulation with research and really propelling research forward. And it is fascinating because we wrote a paper about a few years 2 years ago, I think, that was looking at cannabis use, the medicinal programs after states enact adult use regulation and adult use access and commercialization. And we were at a place in that point where the states that had come before us were already showing a declines in their patient numbers, their patient access. The dispensaries that are just limited to medical cannabis, closing out, they're no longer financially viable. And so we were at that point in Massachusetts where we weren't yet seeing patient numbers drops, or the marijuana treatment centers, which are medical dispensaries here in Massachusetts. We still had a very active medical program, and now we're seeing those dwindling numbers and patients. And we actually had a hearing just last month, hearing from patients to make sure that after adult use comes in, we still have a medical program, and it's still very important to make sure that patients have access to the products, that these products are to a safe standard for disproportionately impacted from illness, and maybe have immunocompromised situations where we can't have the impurities in those products for patients. We need to make sure that we have access to the high THC concentrated products for patients specifically. We need to make sure patients can access these products. Maybe if a dispensary is not local to them, that there's a delivery service, that there's ability for these patients to get access to their medicine. We're already going through, patients already have to go through so many loopholes with the lack of insurance, with the
Right.
social stigma, with the lack of research on clinical benefits, especially when it comes to specific ailments or just specific disorders. And so where they're already fighting loopholes. It's like we need to make sure that when we regulate cannabis and we will provide these commodities, that we're thinking about patients first, especially when adult use comes on, because I do not want to see, you know, but one of my research analysts, Alex Covey, he always says, like, we don't want medical cannabis to be an artifact, right? We want to make sure that we ensure in the processes that we have and the regulation that we need, that the businesses can be financially viable and the patients have access. And they have access to the products that they actually need. And we're not just like giving them adult use products access, because those are different things. They're two completely separate things. So I think
Yeah,
that's
no,
really
it's interesting, so many people think I was actually what I was interviewing Bonnie Goldstein for the series, and she was talking about how people use this word cannabis, right? Or
important.
marijuana, right? And they think it's one thing.
Yeah.
And so she said something that was a big disservice in the area of research is publishing something that just says cannabis is bad, right? When you're not talking about like all the cannabinoids or what was actually in that product. And so it really it's amazing to hear and know that there's regulators that are listening to patients and really taking that the time to not just learn but also publish and share what they're learning with others about this. And I think often I think because of prohibition, the prohibition of cannabis sort of set us up as these issues as black and white, right? Either let it or it's bad or it's good. But also it really set up all of the stakeholders as adversaries, right? So I'm sure I always feel like regulators are it's like the worst job. You're like the most you have you don't have control over what the law is, right? You're given a finite amount of resources to move mountains usually, and you're the closest to the constituents, actually to the stakeholders. So you get yelled at for stuff that you can't control, right? So it's it's definitely a lot. But I think that what I've learned in my experience with regulators is that like it's the most thankless work. And so really the people that are in these jobs are public servants, like in the greatest, definition of that, right? There's not a lot of glory there. And it's really people that just care about that outcome. So so thank you. But in that role, and as you've been really studying this population, what have you found has been a surprise that that was really like kind of took your framework and like, oh, that's interesting.
Well, I mean, just like what you said, about there's like 1,000 shades of gray when it comes to cannabis. And really, I always say that the most humbling experience of my job is that every single day I learn something I didn't know before. Not only that, the science is evolving, the policies are evolving, it's a constantly evolving political landscape. Social norms are changing. Different groups are finding that there's different therapeutic agency. We're seeing the difference between, there's a lot that we potentially didn't know prior that we're having more knowledge about, the THC ratios to other cannabinoids and how that can be the synergistic effects, to youth using for different medicinal purposes and how much that is needed. And so there's just so much that we don't know, and there's so much left to learn. And we talk about a tip of an iceberg. There's nothing like the tip of an iceberg for cannabis. We only know the very top, and there's just so much that we learn. And I hate it when people are closed-minded about it and just say, well, this is bad, or this is good, or this is good only for this or for this. And it's just like we need to start thinking about it in multi-dimensions and think about how it's beneficial and find the risks and balances versus just blanket statements and things like that. And in a compound that has over 100 chemical constituents, the different terpenes, different modes of administration, again, it couldn't be more 100 shades of gray,
Right,
or
right.
1,000 shades of gray, I think I said, because there's just so much to it. We're constantly learning. The learning never stops. The research never stops. And I always say as research, you learn one thing one day, and the thing about research is never done. We're never like, all right, the research is settled, let's move
Right.
on. It's never like
Conclusive, right.
that. It's the research might change next month once we learn more. And once we learn more, we're able to put more, understanding around these things and provide. What I love about Americans for Safe Practice is the amount of education that you give and that you provide. And it's so critical to just have that as the surface, right? If we're talking about the iceberg, should be
Right.
the iceberg of what most of it is containing, is the education. And how do we make sure that we have the most up-to-date education? How do we make sure that patients are educated, providers are educated? Because providers are getting these questions, and in medical schools up to this point, we're like, we don't
Right.
touch this. And
Right.
even the endocrine system, I mean, it wasn't even established in the 1970s. So we are catching up. We're catching up. And I think the one thing I learn every day is how much I don't know.
I think what's interesting is being okay with not knowing. I think it's a very
Yeah.
interesting art, right? I think that um, for I guess when you get into the weeds of regulating a substance like cannabis that really doesn't fit in any of the pockets, right, where you want it to. Everybody wants to just shove it like it is like this, and we keep finding that that doesn't work. But what is interesting about doing this for for such a complex product like cannabis is that if you hold tight to any belief, right, you're gonna it's gonna be hard to work in this space, right? You have to be fluid. And I think when we look at the research that's happened on cannabis in the past, it's mostly been people approaching it with an idea and going and entering the research, which you're never supposed to do that with research, right? You're never supposed to like you're using research to see if an idea is true. But like you said, every day when we learn something new, we're challenging whether this is the substance we thought it was, whether it's going to react with humans the way we thought it was, and if the policies we're creating are actually helpful. And
Yeah. I can give you a first-hand experience of how humility knocked me on my feet.
yeah.
So when I was doing my dissertation, I came from the background of public health and youth prevention.
Mhm.
And so after losing my brother, I really got into the prevention, and in the whole, at this time, the theory between does cannabis lead to harder drugs? Which has now been moot. The studies are that research may be kind of, you can
Yeah,
close the door on that
yeah, yeah.
for a large amount of it. Um, but when I was doing my dissertation, I thought that cannabis laws, and at that time it was only medical cannabis laws, would influence youth access to cannabis and their use of cannabis.
Mhm,
And that didn't pan out in 2015 when I finished
mhm.
my dissertation, and it still has not panned out. That these laws do not necessarily create access or increase use at the macro level. There are problematic use and things like that are, again, a niche topic that needs to be discussed, but it doesn't mean all of it's bad. It's one other piece of the situation. You know what I mean? I think just coming together and balancing that. And so I've kind of done a 180 in my own thought process, because what I thought didn't happen. And I follow science, and it's funny because in more recent years, I have been, just the therapeutic agency of it. Like, I've known people my whole life, obviously, that have used for therapeutic reasons. And so now I love getting into that space and learning more and more about the therapeutic agency and how we can, facilitate that, and how do we learn about it, and how do we learn about it in this new era of medicinal, of healthcare. After COVID, healthcare has all changed, and more people are relying on these things, and what they believe, and what they think is going to be therapeutic, or is subjectively is therapeutic to them. And I really think that we, as regulators, as researchers, we need to ride the wave of what's actually happening, and not what we think is happening, or what we want to see happen, or we don't want to see happen. Like, we need to actually go with reality and what's happening, and be able to be flexible in our mindsets. And in the whole, in the equity space, it's reach people where they're at, meet people where they're at, understand what they're using and why they're using, and how we can help them. you know
Right. No, I love that. And I think it's really, part of, I think a good educator is making sure that the people hear what it is that you want to educate them, not necessarily what it is, that you're educating, but that people are actually hearing it. But I think the same is true for research, right? That you're actually researching what is happening.
Yeah.
And I know, that's obviously with there's so little resources for research, and within the cannabis space, that's really been sort of dominated by NIDA and really only researching the harms. And we are seeing some funds coming from the state programs to fill in some of those gaps. But if funding was not a an issue, it's always a fun question. If you weren't looking at who was going to fund this study, what would you love to be working on? Like what part of the cannabis space would really excite you?
um Oh God, I see. I love the cannabis space because I'm not sucked into one corner, one
Yeah, yeah.
niche. I am really, and that's what's great. Even I'm not talking about my job at the time, but like really thinking about all different parts of cannabis legalization, and how, again, I love to learn. I love being in a gray area. I don't want to know anything for fact. Like, I want to keep on learning. And I love that space to be able to really just, have questions and talk to different groups and be like, what are concerns that you have, and how do we facilitate that? How do we actually learn? What are the research gaps, and how do we fill those in? When it comes to medicinal products and just the federal scheduling, what always concerns me is that the cannabis coming from the drug supply program is a whole different product than the product that patients are actually using in their own their your own state level programs. And just being able to harness actual products that patients are using for studies. It boggles my mind that we still don't have this yet, and multiple states are trying to like go around the corners, in Massachusetts too, with like a research facility license so you can use those products. But I mean, we're not even harnessing the best products to do the best research.
Mhm,
You know what I mean? I think we're way behind, because the access to products that we need to be able to do clinical trials, and randomized control trials, which are the cream of the crop when it comes to research. We need researchers to be able to access the cannabis that patients are using.
yeah.
And then it's constantly evolving in the landscape. There's so many things that we don't know, and I mean, think about the therapeutic agency. I mean, it's been thousands of years that people have used cannabis for different varying reasons. It's not just mental health or physical health or things like that. They're using it for a whole host of different reasons and applying those things from different in different ways, like modes of administration. There's just so much to learn, and it's really unfortunate that we're not using cannabis that we have, the better quality cannabis to be able to look at these studies and really affect patients moving forward. So that's what I would love to do. I can't do that clinical research myself, but I would love to be able to facilitate it.
Nice, nice. No, and I think that when we're looking at the future of cannabis medicine, I feel like it's important to, to look at the history as well, sort of how we got here. And I think one of the challenges that I see for people is that they really just see one side of cannabis history, that they're really just looking at the prohibition, which is, it's a huge part of the history of this plant. But if you look at the history of drug development, scientific discovery, and botanical medicines in this country, you can start seeing a more sort of holistic look at cannabis and how it's been used in our society. And part of me thinks that maybe we're just right on time, right? Like cannabis as a medicine is just right on time, because I think a lot of people think that like the discovery of the endocannabinoid system, that was halted by prohibition. It had nothing to do with prohibition of cannabis. We actually just couldn't see anandamide. We didn't have the tools to actually see it. And so I think, regulators moving forward are going to play a huge role in one, in a way, telling advocates what's possible, like what can actually be systematized, like
Yeah.
what that will look like. But also, telling policymakers like what is actually happening, like how that gap between policy and regulations. I think, um, you know, uh, one of the most in-depth conversations I have with regulators has come around our State of the States report, right, where we are actually like diving in and grading. And what's been interesting is most of the conversations I have with the regulators are actually calling and saying like, actually, we don't do that. Don't give us points for that, right? Because they really want the legislators to know, that they are going to have to change the law if they want regulators to do that. So, I know at American Safe Access, we are looking at a national program, right? I think that a lot of the pains that we're feeling between state adult use and medical are really just the challenge of developing medicine in a geofenced population, right? I would say, like, imagine if at the beginning of the pandemic, if Congress had turned to pharma and said, create a vaccine for Rhode Island, like
Yes,
how many
exactly.
companies would really step up and do that? Um, but I think, as we're looking at that vision, right, that which could mean people that are creating products in Massachusetts that are really working for patients, they'd be able to really double down on the R&D and get those to patients around the country. What are your hopes for sort of the future of medical cannabis?
That people that are truly passionate about helping patients and care about legalization um, for that benefit should really think, to stop holding things close to your chest and to really see us all at the same table, the same mission, the same goals. We're all want to work at the same table. We want to be, different puzzle pieces to figure this out together. And I really think it's interesting in the cannabis space how many people are just I don't know the dynamic, but it's very interesting. Like we're all trying to do the same thing, that we should put our minds together and really figure out how to do this right, how to get access, and you're right, like you wouldn't have one vaccine for just Rhode Island, right? You would have a whole different people, you have whole different stakeholders at the table. So it's not just clinical researchers that can do the work. We need advocates at the table. We need regulators at the table. We need stakeholders that do statute versus regulation at the table together and talking to each other. And patients, we need to hear from patients. We need that subjective experience, but we also need the quantitative data from hard science to be able to supplement that. And so I really wish people would put down their guards and really work together and see us all at the same table and working for the same thing and really advocating for patients and what is needed and stop fighting with each other. It's the infighting. Because there's so many brilliant people in this space.
Yeah,
And I just think about how much we could achieve if we were working together.
no, I love
And I
that.
see the same space for state to state, it's like the access and you know what I mean? Like if you have insulin. It's not like you're going to leave your insulin alone at home because you're flying to Hawaii. You take that medicine with you everywhere. And I mean, it points to the fact that there are so many gaps and there's so many holes between federal policy, state level policy, state lines, and it would just be wonderful if we start to see and work together and see how do we do this? How do we figure out these gaps and find solutions?
Fantastic. No, I love that. I think that prohibition also makes people paranoid. I think they're for good reason. A lot of people haven't been able to be funded. People have lost their jobs, their children, their homes. And I think, finding, that safe space to contribute has always been a major part of Americans for Safe Access of our mission is just holding space where good intentions can come together, but actually result in policies that help patients. So I'm so excited to know you. I'm so excited that the medical cannabis community and movement has someone like yourself working with us and thinking with us as we move this forward. And I just want to, if you have any final thoughts before we sign off.
Well, it's really interesting because we talk about prohibition, but if we think about it, cannabis has been legal for so much longer than it's been illegal. And so you say something brilliantly about maybe we're at the perfect time. And I really do think that, like, maybe we are at the perfect time right now to create these novel, products for patients that just weren't even capable of it before because the science wasn't there yet. I want the science to continue to evolve. So thank you for being a partner for this. Thank you for doing all of the work that you do for patients, for access, and for patient equity. So thank
Thank
you for
you.
having me today.
Of
It's been
course, Julie.
lovely to see you again, as always.